Hello, I'm ANEKA from Made to Sew, and welcome to part 3 of our pattern matching tutorials. Now, in the last 2 tutorials, we covered the rules that you need to consider when pattern matching, where to actually place the pattern of the fabric on your individual body. Then we looked at actually cutting your fabric out, making sure that we achieved the match that we wanted in all of the places. Now it's time to sew our garment together. So we need to be looking at actually how to sew the seams, making sure that we achieve the same match that we plan to when cutting our fabric out. So I've gone ahead and cut out all of the pieces that I need in my fabric, just like you should have done. And I'm going to be showing you how to actually match a standard straight seam, so be that a side seam or an underarm seam, and then we're going to look at how to match sleeve seams because they're a little bit more complicated. I'm going to be discussing some tips that you can use to make sure that you achieve the match, and a couple of little tools that I use to help me do that. Now, I've decided to add a part 4 onto these pattern matching tutorials because I thought it might be useful to film how to insert a zip, an invisible zip, and make sure that you achieve the match along the invisible zipper. Now, join me back here once you've got your fabric all cut out and we can begin. Let's begin by looking at how to match a standard seam. And in this case, we're going to look at matching a side seam. So the front to the back at this side here. Now I've got my fabric right sides together, so this is my front and this is one of my back pieces. You will notice that the wrong side of my fabric has actually been interlined. If you want to know more about interlining, or if you want to interline your fabric, then I have a tutorial that I will link to. I've used silk organza to interline this linen, and that's to give it a bit more structure and to help prevent it from creasing. I have gone ahead and also finished the edges of my fabric with the overlocker or serger. You're going to want to begin by putting the right sides of the fabric together and matching the edges that you want to sew. You're going to want to match the top and the bottom of the seam together and any notches. And you can just roughly pin the fabric together at these points as a starting point. Now I'm going to show you closer up how we actually make sure we achieve a match here. Now, a couple of ways that you can do this. You can work with your wrong side facing up like I've got here. And what I do like to do is to fold back the top layer to expose the pattern that you want to match. Now, what we need to remember here is that you need to match it on the stitching line. So you need to remember your seam allowances. With this garment, my seam allowances are 5/8 of an inch, 1.5 centimeters. So I must achieve the match 1.5 centimeters or 5/8 in from the edge of the fabric. Now, you might find that you've got a good eye for measurements, and I do find that I would probably do this without a ruler, but that's because I've been sewing a long time. If you're new to sewing, I would recommend that you double check what you think is 5/8 or 1.5 centimeters is correct. And then what I would like you to do is to position the fabric so that you achieve that match. So you can move the 2 layers together to make sure that the stripes, plaid, check, whatever it is matching up. And then I would fold it back and put a pin on it. Now I will be pinning exactly on the line that I will be sewing later on, because again, that is the key bit that you want to match. Now, if you've watched any of my other tutorials, you will probably know that I do like to what's called pin based. So I'm pinning along my stitching line or always in the seam allowance. And this is a good time to actually pin like this on the stitching line, because you will then find in a second that we can take a look at this from the right side to check that we've achieved the match we want. When it comes to pattern matching, I would always position in more pins than you normally do because you want to hold the pattern matched in all of the locations. Now I've gone ahead and pinned the majority of my seam together. You will see that I've used 1 pin for each of these stripes or checks that I want to match. And that's because, as I said, if you don't pin it, it won't necessarily be matched. So you do want to use more pins than you normally would. You also need to consider what you planned in the cutting out stage. for this garment, we'd planned a match all the way up until we got to the dart. The dart was going to throw the check off, so I wasn't going to be able to achieve a match above that. So, in that case, it doesn't matter. All I'm going to need to do is to make sure that above the dart, ideally, both sides are the same. So when I'm sewing the other side seam together, I will need to check it against the first side seam. Once you've pinned the whole of your seam, you might just want to take your ruler and check that your pins are on the 5/8, 1.5 centimetres line, or whatever your seam allowance is. When you're happy with that, we can take a look from the right side. And we want to really pull this apart to see whether where the pin's in, you're going to achieve a match. And you want to look all the way up and down your seam on the places that you planned to have a match. And mine is looking pretty good here. Now, although that's my preferred method, I wanted to show you another method that I do use from time to time. Now, again, I'm going to be looking at this side seam here. So it's the front to the other back. And what you're going to want to do with this method is to press under your seam allowance. Mine was 5/8 of an inch, 1.5 centimetres. Yours could be different. On just the one side. So I've only done this on the back. And I've accurately pressed this under, used a ruler to check that it does measure the seam allowance. And my front, you can see here, doesn't have anything pressed under. Then what you're going to do is to overlap them. And now it doesn't actually matter which one you overlap. So whether you pressed under the front or the back, it doesn't matter. It's just a case of being able to see your pattern matching flat. Again, you would match the bottom of the seam, match the top of the seam, match your notches. And you must also match the two edges of the fabric still when you're doing this. And then once you've matched the edges of the fabric, you can tweak your match of your check or plaid or whatever it is. Now, this can be quite useful if you're matching pictures because they're a little bit trickier to do in the other method that I showed. So sometimes I will do this and you're going to have to pin flat on the top like this. So check that the pins don't damage your fabric. Use silk pins if you need to. But if you have got a pattern, especially a complex pattern that you're trying to match, often this will be my starting point. And I would do this all the way down the seam. The difficulty with this technique, and the reason why I will only use it when I need to, is because what you need to do next is to go to the inside, and you're then going to need to actually pin in that crease. So when you're placing your pins on the top layer here, I would leave a bit of space between them. These two, perfect. This one's a little bit close. So when I turn that fabric back, I can get in to the area there and I can see my crease, but I won't be able to get in between the two other pins. So I am pinning in the crease that I pressed previously. And I would have to do this all the way down so that I could then come back out and take these pins out. You are doing exactly the same thing as the first method achieves. It's just, as I said, sometimes useful to be able to see it flat and to really see the nitty-gritty of the pattern. No matter which method you used, you should now have your two layers of fabric pinned together and you should be happy with the match from the right side. Usually you would take your fabric to the sewing machine and you would sew this seam. However, if you were to go ahead and do that, you might achieve a match, you might not achieve a match. You might find that you get a match in some places and not in others, and then you're having to unpick areas. Now, I personally am not a fan of unpicking, and I will try and limit the amount of unpicking that I have to do. So I have other tools that I use here to help me to achieve a perfect match first time around. I'm going to talk through 3 different options, and then I'm going to show you in detail how I would do each of the options. Now, option number 1 is to baste or tack the seam together, and this is the traditional method really. You need a needle and you need some thread. Now, I tend to use a basting thread, a cotton basting thread, or a silk basting thread. The reason is they're designed for basting or tacking, so the cotton is quite textured, it won't slip out of the fabric, it also breaks very, very easily, which means that taking it out afterwards is easy. If I'm working with a delicate fabric such as silk, then I probably will pick up the silk because it's smoother to glide through the fabric and I won't be damaging those delicate fabrics. However, if you don't have these, do not worry, you can just work with a normal thread as well. Now, when it comes to basting or tacking, you're going to need to make sure that you do it accurately and that it is tight enough to hold the seam together where you should be holding it to achieve your match. I will share that technique with you in a second. Now, I have a lot of customers that aren't massive fans of hand sewing, so if you don't want to be hand sewing, there are some other options. Option number 2 are these amazing clover fork pins. Now, you may have seen them on some of my other tutorials. I'm a big fan of these. They were designed for quilting originally, and we actually will position the pin into the seam and you will sew over them. They're the only pins that I would recommend you can sew over. Do be cautious as you do so, but they were designed to be sewn over. And they will help you to achieve a match. There are times when I will actually position these in as well as baste and tack a seam if I've got a really tricky fabric. Finally, if my fabric is a real pig and is causing me an absolute nightmare, then I will go to a tape. And you've got a Wonder tape or a basting tape. Now, these tapes are almost like double-sided sticky tape. You're going to stick them between the 2 layers of fabric, and I tend to use them as a last resort. Now, the Wonder tape was designed to wash off, so I would prefer using this over the basting tape because that doesn't actually wash away from the garment afterwards. Both of them are designed to be sewn through, therefore they're designed to not gum up your sewing machine needle, but I probably would recommend that you replace your needle afterwards and maybe do some testing. So I'm going to go through how I would use each of these methods now. You're going to want to begin by taking your needle and threading it with a single layer of thread. Now, to start, you can either tie a knot at the end of your thread or simply sew over yourself like I'm doing here. Now, our plan when it comes to basting or tacking is going to be to sew on the line that you plan to stitch on. So this is going to be the stitching line of the garment, and in my case it's 5/8 of an inch, 1.5 centimetres from the edge. Now, often when it comes to basting and tacking, people will want to sew close to the line but not on the line. However, in my opinion, when it comes to pattern matching, if you don't stitch on the line that you're going to sew on the sewing machine, you won't necessarily achieve a match all the way along. Especially if you're working with a difficult fabric, a loose weave, something stretchy, you will find that the fabric can still move. The downside to stitching on the line is that it can be difficult to unpick or remove from your fabric because you'll have sewn over the basting or tacking on the sewing machine. Therefore, if you are working with a difficult fabric, so say something like a taped tweed or a boucle, perhaps you're making a Chanel style jacket, then I would recommend that you use a thread that isn't the same colour as your fabric but isn't too different. What I'm trying to suggest here is that you don't use a red thread on a white fabric, because if it's tricky to unpick afterwards, you don't want to be left with little bits of red thread in your seams. Now we're going to complete stitches that measure 1/4 of an inch or 5 millimetres in length. And the key here is that they need to be firm and tight. You don't want it to be loose, like perhaps a standard basting or tacking stitch. The idea is that we are almost hand sewing this first before putting it through the machine. We want to really hold the 2 layers of fabric together to keep the pattern that we've pinned in place matched. If you're unsure where your stitching line is, then I recommend using a ruler and some chalk to actually draw it on first so that you've got an accurate line to follow. And you're simply going to do this all the way along a seam. If you run out of thread, then you can either knot it or sew over yourself at the end and again start again with a new thread. It's very easy and simple. You do just need to make sure that you're stitching on the sewing line and that your stitches are nice, tight and secure. Now I'm going to leave you to sew the rest of your seam if you're planning on using this method. As you can see, I have finished sewing all of my seam. Now, the second option is to use these little clover fork pins. You can use them on their own or as well as having tacked or basted your seam. Now, these pins were actually designed for quilting. They were designed to help you get a match when you're completing patchwork. So they are designed to be sewn over. Now, you can see that the back edge of this is raised. Now, you want to position this with the raised bit facing up. You don't want that to be going down onto the sewing machine bed. You want to make sure that you position the point out towards the edge of the fabric. Now, if I'm positioning these in, whether I have hand sewn the seam or not, I will still check the match, and I can, even if I've basted or tacked this, I can still tweak the match ever so slightly so that it's perfect. And then I will position in my pin, and I'm going to be positioning the legs either side of what I want to match, just like so. Now you need to make sure that you're positioning these in so that you're going in and out either side of the stitching line. Obviously, if you don't position the pin in the right place, so over the stitching line, when you sew, it won't actually match your fabric. Now, these pins are fantastic, and there are times when I really do need to use them. If you're working with a loose weave fabric, so again that could be a taped tweed or a boucle, you could be working with a stretch fabric, so a jersey or a knit, and you can find that no matter how much you baste, tack your fabric, how many pins you put in, the fabric and pattern can still move because the fabric has a little bit of movement in it. And that's where these pins come in handy. Now, you don't necessarily need to put the pins in on every point you want to match. Sometimes I will do every other. It just depends on the fabric that I'm working with and what I'm obviously planning on matching. To give you a quick idea, this fabric here is what I would call a taped tweed. Some people might refer to it as a boucle, but it's basically very loosely woven. Now, this is the sleeve of a jacket, and you can just about see the seam here. Now, when I was constructing this, I basted or tacked my seams together to achieve the match that I've got here. It was very tricky because the fabric frays a lot. It's very loosely woven and it sort of went in and out of a pattern. So I sewed it on the machine and it wasn't quite right. I then had to unpick it and I was finding that it was unravelling really badly. So I went to the clover pins. I positioned in my clover pins and I achieved a match first time. Now I will be sewing a seam with you on the sewing machine in a second, so I will be sharing some tips for sewing over these pins in a cautious manner. Now, if the other two options haven't worked and you need some extra help, I would recommend going for the wonder tape or basting tape. Now, this is generally my last resort. As an example, I had a dress I was making before Christmas. It was a knit fabric with a stripe, and I was having trouble inserting the invisible zipper into the back seam. I just couldn't achieve that perfect match. So I picked up my wonder tape and achieved a perfect match first time. So how do you use this? The tape is effectively a double-sided sticky tape. So as you roll it off, one side will be sticky. So you're going to need to unpin your layers of fabric because we need to position the tape in between the two layers. Now, I would recommend that you cut the tape into sections because you will find, especially if you've got a curved seam, that you won't actually be able to place the tape on in one continuous length. Now, you're going to want to position the inside edge of the tape on or just touching the stitching line. You're not going to want to position it in any further than that because then it might appear on the right side of the garment, and although this will wash off, it could mark your fabric. Now, I recommend that you draw your stitching line onto your fabric using chalk, just like so. Or if you prefer, you could obviously press under your seam allowance like we did on this side. Now you're going to position the tape with the edge against the drawn line, or if you're working with the pressed seam allowance, it's going to be right up against the crease. You'll want to press this down firmly so that it sticks onto the first layer, and then you're going to peel off the top of the tape. Now this tape, it comes off quite easily. Some are obviously trickier than others. Now we effectively have our double-sided sticky tape. So the top of the tape is now sticky in order for us to attach the second layer. So we need to position the second layer down on top. You're going to want to match up the edges of the fabric and also the pattern. So we can do this from the wrong side, or it might be easier to do this from the right side so that you can see the pattern that you're trying to match. You want to work your way along the seam, making sure you have the match in all of the locations. Now, sometimes I'll only position a little bit of tape on the parts of the pattern that I want to match. You don't necessarily need to do it all the way down the seam. Now you're going to go to the sewing machine and you're going to stitch on the stitching line, and it's going to be right up against the edge of that tape. Now, once you've sewn the seam, you're going to want to remove the tape if you're planning on pressing your seam allowances open. If you're positioning your seam allowances to one side or in one direction, then it doesn't matter. And obviously this tape will wash away. Now, because this tape stays in the seam until it's been washed or you remove it, it is my third option. However, as I mentioned, there are times when this tape is fantastic because the other options haven't worked. Now we're going to head to the sewing machine and I'm going to show you some tips for sewing over the clover fork pins. Now, when it comes to putting your pattern matching through the sewing machine, there's one thing that I would really recommend, and that is to use a walking foot. You want to use a walking foot, or if your sewing machine has it, a dual feed foot, and mine is this little thing on the back here. Now, you'll generally only get a dual feed on more expensive sewing machines, so you'll probably find purchasing a walking foot is your best option. But both of them will do the same thing. They're going to pull through both the top and the bottom layer of fabric at the same time and provide what's called an even feed. This will help to prevent any shift of one layer moving quicker than the other, and therefore your pattern not matching. So my fabric's in, I'm happy with where I'm sewing. I've got a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, 1.5 centimetres. I've done my usual back stitch at the start, and I'm going to guide my fabric through the machine now. As I get to my clover fork pins, I'm just going to take it slowly. You should find that the sewing machine needle avoids the clover fork pins. I think I've only hit one of the pins perhaps once, but you do just need to be cautious because you do not want to hit the pin. You don't want it to damage your sewing machine. And there we go, over to the other side. And the same, you're just going to continue this all the way up. I would always recommend sewing any pattern match seam slowly. You don't want to be rushing this. You want to make sure that the pattern stays matched and that you don't need to unpick it afterwards. Because I've also basted and tacked this seam, I should be stitching on that line. And I'll work my way all the way up the seam, back stitch when I get to the other end. And if you watch closely, you can see the little jewel feed just gripping on and pulling the fabric through at the back of my foot. So I have gone ahead and I have sewn both of the side seams on this garment. Now you always want to check when you complete the second side seam that you're achieving the match in the same places. For example, with this garment, the pattern will be matched up to the dart, and then above the dart it won't be matched. However, I still want it to be the same on both sides. You then want to check that you're happy with the match. You want to open it up and take a really good look here, sort of pulling open the seam to check that you've got a match in all of the locations up and down the seam that you've sewn. Now, if you did baste or tack your seam, you're going to need to remove your basting and tacking threads. You want to do that with a pair of scissors or an unpicker. Use an unpicker to unpick every few stitches, and then you can pull on the threads to remove them. The threads should come out relatively easily. I used the cotton basting thread here, and you can see that even though I've sewn on top of my basting or tacking stitches, the thread is coming out nice and easily. If you have any really stubborn bits of thread that you're struggling to remove, I would recommend grabbing a pair of tweezers. You can then get a good grip on the thread and give it a good pull out of the fabric, rather than trying to do it with the tips of your fingers. Now you're going to do this all the way along the seam, and then we're going to head to the iron. Now I've removed all of my basting and tacking stitches. The next step is to give it a bit of an iron. I'm going to press the seam flat first using the iron. And by pressing it flat, it helps to meld the stitches into the fabric or between the layers of fabric. This is also a useful tip that you can do prior to actually sewing your fabric on the machine. If you are pattern matching and you have basted or tacked the seam first, you may find it useful to press flat on the seam before running it through the sewing machine. Again, that will help to sort of get the layers of fabric to stick together a little bit, so it helps to prevent any creep with your machine sewing on the pattern matching. Then you're going to need to work your way along the seam, pressing your seam allowances open or in the direction your pattern suggests. It might be to one side or the other. As you can see, I've gone ahead and pressed all of my seam allowances open because that's what I need for the pattern that I'm working with. Now, I just wanted to mention here that if you are unhappy with any part of the pattern matching, you don't need to necessarily go and unpick the whole of the seam and redo the whole seam. You can just unpick the small section that you are unhappy with. So it might just be one stripe or plaid that doesn't match up. Unpick that area, and then you will need to retack or baste the area, perhaps use your clover fork pin to make sure that it does match, and then go back to the sewing machine and sew the gap up. Just remember to backstitch at the start and at the end to secure your new little row of stitching. Now you can see the match that I have sewn all the way down here. Now the method that we used for this seam is the same method that you would use on the majority of seams in your garment. So side seams, centre back seams, shoulder seams. In the next part of the tutorial, I'm going to be covering how to insert a bolt-on sleeve and making the pattern match around the top of the sleeve cap. Now when it comes to inserting a sleeve into a matched garment, I would always pin both sleeves in first, rather than do one sleeve and then do the other. It just means that you can keep checking between them that you're going to get a symmetrical match on both of the sleeves. So I've gone ahead and pinned my first one in here. I'm going to do the other one with you. Now I have prepared my sleeve. I've sewn the underarm seam, I've pressed it open. I have also completed my easing stitches around the top of the sleeve cap. If you haven't inserted a sleeve before, then I would recommend that you watch my sleeve insertion tutorial, and I'd probably recommend you do it in a plain fabric first before you go ahead and do it in a pattern. As with inserting a normal sleeve, you want to check that you're putting the right sleeve into the right armhole. The rule is that there will be a single notch for the front and a double notch for the back. So I know this sleeve is the correct sleeve for this armhole. Now I'm going to bring you in a little bit closer to show you how we're going to match this all the way around. Now I've gone ahead and eased the top of my sleeve cap. Just like you would with a normal sleeve, you always start positioning the bottom of the sleeve and the underarm together because that's the bit that hasn't had the easing stitches. You would match up. In my case, it's a seam, so the seam of my sleeve to my underarm seam. In your case, it might be a square or a circle because you may have a two-piece sleeve or you may not have a seam here on your garment. So just be cautious of that. And we would put right sides together. And we can just pop a pin in there. Then we will reach inside the garment. So my hand's going through the armhole so that I can grab the rest of this and position it. Ready. So I'm now working from the inside of my garment, and I've got the right side of my sleeve attached to the right side of my garment. And I'm going to work by pinning the underarm bit together. So I have matched those two seams together. And I'm just going to pin the stable part of the sleeve together now. So this part we hadn't planned a match, so we're not going to worry about this area too much. Work a little bit up the front and a little bit up the back. And this is again in my sleeve insertion tutorial. So if you want a slower refresher of this, please refer to that. And the other rule we have here is we need to match the top notch of the sleeve to, in my case, it's the shoulder seam. Yours again could be 2 notches. You may or may not have a seam at the top of the shoulder, but you'll be matching something up there. Then you roughly want to release any easing in your sleeve so that the back of the sleeve is the same as the garment and the same on the front. So we want the sleeve to be the same size as the garment here so that it's ready to go together. And you want to try and distribute any easing so that you don't have any lumps and bumps or pleats or tucks. Now, this is when we need to start having a little look from the outside as well as from the inside, because these are the areas where we want to have some matching. Now I'm going to begin with the front here because that's the most important part. Obviously, we'll take a front match over a back match. And let's have a look at it from the front. Now from the front, it's going to be a little bit clearer as to what part of the pattern we want to match. Obviously, we already planned this when we cut out the garment. And generally speaking, the sleeves are actually slightly easier to match in the fabric than in the paper. Because of the easing, you normally have a little bit of give around the top of that sleeve cap. So what we need to look at is which of the checks in this case are going to match. So this line here, I'm going to want to match to this line here. And this is where it's important that you pin both sleeves, check both sleeves, even before you go ahead and baste and tack them, because you want to make sure they are both exactly the same. So I think that is going to go to that there nicely, and that looks similar on the other side. Obviously, you need to take into consideration your seam allowances here as well. And then I'm going to reach in and grab that section and then pop a pin in. And this is where it's a little bit fiddlier with the sleeve because you need to do a little bit, pin a little bit, check it again. So I'm happy with that bit so far. Right, can I get this line here to match up with the line across here? Hopefully I have done on the other side. And it might be that I need to pull my easing stitches a bit in that area. It might not be. You can also look at it from the inside and take a look and match them up there. I tend to do a little bit of both when it comes to the sleeves. So I'll work from both the inside and the outside of the garment. This is also a good time for you to put your pins in, like we spoke about when we were doing the garment, in a pin basting method, because it means that the pins are as it's going to be sewn on the machine. So when we look at it from the right side, as long as the pins are on the stitching line, everything is as it will be when you have sewn it. Now I'm quite happy so far with the matches that I've got here and here. And the size of the check I really need to look at. I need to make sure that it all looks exactly the same on both sides. And it does so far. So I'm quite happy with what I've achieved on the front. Now we need to go and have a look at the same area on the back of the sleeve. Now onto the back. This is the side that I've already pinned, and I've managed to achieve a match across here and this one here. So I want to try and do the same on the other side. So it's going to be matching that one to that one, and you just want to take your time and gradually match the bits you need together. Another useful technique is to take your pen and to position it through the part of the check that you want to match. Make sure that you do this on the stitching line. Then you're going to grab the other part that you want to match it to. So I'm trying to match to this horizontal line here, and again position that through on the stitching line. And that is a good way of getting at least a starting point for your matching. Just move the ease about, and you can be quite forceful here with any pattern matching. There are times when you want to achieve that match and you sometimes need to be a little bit forceful to achieve it. Again, you're going to need more pins than you normally would. You just want to keep adding them to really get everything nicely pinned together. Once you've pinned both sleeves in, you're happy with the matching that you've achieved and they're both symmetrical. You're going to want to baste or tack the sleeves into the armhole. You're going to want to complete this using the same method I showed you on a normal seam, making sure it's nice and tight, 1/4 inch 5mm stitches. Now, I would always recommend that you baste and tack your sleeves. You can put your clover pins in as well, but I would always recommend you baste and tack them. It means you just get a chance to have a double check before you have to sew it through the machine. I will leave you to baste or tack yours in place, and then I will show you what the sleeves look like, ready to sew on the machine. So, as you can see, I have basted or tacked the sleeve into the armhole. I have also added the addition of clover fork pins at the key areas that I want to achieve my match, and one at the underarm seam here. So then we would go to the sewing machine, and you would sew this just like you would sew a normal sleeve. I would start at the underarm and pass the whole of the underarm before going up and over the top of the sleeve. Obviously, take the tips that I showed you earlier on the machine for working with your patterned fabric. Again, if you are unsure about inserting a sleeve, then I recommend you watch my How to Insert a Sleeve tutorial. And here you have it, 2 perfectly matched sleeves. So I've sewn both of these on the sewing machine. I've removed my basting, trimmed all my threads, removed my easing stitches, and then the next step I would go and finish these with the overlocker or serger. As always, I really hope you enjoyed the tutorial and that you've learned some new techniques that will enable you to work with a patterned fabric on your next garment. Thanks for watching and hope to see you again soon.